Good afternoon, participants. Good afternoon, dear viewers who follow our today's session. Today, we are going to talk about inflation. And during our today's discussion, we are going to focus on three key blocks of issues. But before we get down to business, let me introduce to you all our participants. To the left is Alexander Isakov, Chief Economist of VTB. He is in inflation research for many years now, and I think he's going to share the outcomes of his research with us. We also have Pavel Malkov, head of the Federal State Statistics Service, Rosstat. Joining us is Alexander Morozov, Director of the Research and Forecasting Department, Bank of Russia. And joining us online is Andrei Budarin, Deputy Head of Federal Tax Service of Russia. And the Federal Service has been providing us with data that we are using increasingly actively in analyzing inflation-related processes. Unfortunately, Polina Krushkova from the Ministry of Economic Development of Russia has not been able to join us today, but we are going to speak about these issues, the five of us. And as I said, there are three big blocks of issues. We would like to start from having a look at the consumer price index. We'd like to talk whether this is indeed a good indicator that allows targeting inflation. The next big question is how exactly we should calculate the consumer price index, how good the methodology for calculating it is, and what can be perfected, what can be improved. And the last part of our discussion is going to be dedicated to something that I've already announced today, namely new technologies that are currently used to collect and analyze information. We will talk about how these technologies can influence our methodology for calculating the consumer price index and also what changes it can entail in our statistics. Let me start with whether we are targeting the right thing, whether the consumer price index is at all a good indicator for inflation targeting. The world experience demonstrates that the overwhelming majority of countries seek to conduct inflation targeting through the consumer price index. That is the world trend. Even though there are some exceptions, I believe all the panelists and many of our viewers know that the US Fed prefers to look at the deflation of consumer expenses, which probably has a wider scope with regard to the consumer basket of both goods and services, whereas the European Central Bank, when targeting inflation, has come up with a special index, which has been harmonized across all European countries. So, in brief, there are exceptions to the rule. First, I would like to give the floor to Alexander. What do you think about that? Your department has conducted different studies, so are we targeting the correct indicator? Yes, thank you. From the outset, I would like to say that we are targeting the right thing given the circumstances, and I'll try to explain to you why. If we look at the experience of other countries, then we'll see that most countries are targeting the consumer price index. Yes, there is the US that Kirill has mentioned, and there are the central banks of Sweden and the Czech Republic that target the average annualized baseline inflation. And you know, we use the consumer price index as the increase in prices from December to December. And this is the methodology that we use. Some countries use a little different methods to calculate the CPI. But we've been doing that for quite some time. Yes, there are some critical arguments, there is some criticism, but at least everyone understands what we're talking about when the CPI is talked about. Now, when we look at the base inflation, we also need to be very clear about the terms. It is also important to understand that from the point of view of inflation targeting policy pursued by the Bank of Russia, the indicator that we use based on the experience of the last 5 years demonstrates that we do manage to accomplish the task that we have set forth before ourselves. We manage to rein in inflation, to make it under 4% or so. So using this indicator for inflation targeting really is successful in Russia. There's another thing I would like to add. As we have noticed, once we manage to bring the inflation rate down to 4% or even below that, then the polls conducted by Rosstat among our population have demonstrated that concern around price increase had not disappeared entirely, but it had ceased to be the priority issue for the citizens. So it was relegated down in terms of main concerns on the citizens' list. So we use the indicator and we managed to rein in the price increase, and that is something society is quite satisfied. Currently, yes, it's a little different. Inflation rate has gone over 4%, and once again, the increase in prices has emerged to the forefront. If there is a social consensus, not currently, but under lower inflation rates, if the consensus says that even a 4% increase in prices, speaking about the CPI, of course, if it's perceived as a problem, then probably it's worth targeting a lower inflation rate, because even though the perceived increase in price is going to be more acceptable to social consensus, to society. Got that. Well, in that case, I would like to give the floor to Alexander Isakov. You've been saying for quite some time now that it would be a good idea to incorporate imputed lease payments into the CPI, namely the expenditure that population is spending on either leasing a flat or paying for the flat, even if it's their propriety. So not the actual payments, not the actual expenses, but the imputed ones. But what's the logic, what's the rationale behind that proposal of yours? Why do you think this would better reflect the inflation rates? I guess before responding to that question, just briefly, could you comment on the first question that I asked during this session, whether we are targeting the correct indicator? I believe these two issues are interconnected. As a matter of fact, this is one and the same question. I believe that. But what's the logic behind that? First, let's put all the dots. I share the Bank of Russia's approach as well as the approach of our Federal Statistics Service. This is absolutely correct from the point of view of our current methodology. But there are some issues, of course, because the Bank of Russia and other federal services are conducting polls, and as we can see, perceived inflation is different from the one we calculate according to our methodology. And I don't think that we should discard that right away. We need to have an in-depth look at the root causes. The thing is, we are underappreciated in the mandate of ensuring price stability and the purchasing capacity, parity of our currency in particular. We are underappreciating the role of the real estate market because the purchasing power of the ruble is also about your capacity to buy a house, an apartment, anything to live in. So far, this housing is undervalued in terms of the CPI. Yes, there is the lease element, the lease of a one-room flat, a two-room flat, but in terms of how largely it's taken into account, then you'll see that it's not even as important as sausages in the index. So it's underrepresented. And we're not the only country that finds itself in this situation. And many countries have already managed to address that issue. Yesterday, we listened to the head of the Reserve Bank of South Africa, and South Africa takes into account this imputed lease, and many other countries do that when they calculate the CPI. It can be done through various means, and I know that Rostad is currently pursuing this avenue in order to better understand how to take into account the imputed lease, imputed rent. And I think the best option is to take into account the cost of your housing based on the rent that you would be paying yourself if you lived in a flat. There are some technical arguments to corroborate that, but the most important thing is that we are already doing precisely that when we calculate our GDP, and the GDP takes into account the imputed rent, and we should have long started to do that when calculating the CPI. Then it would have helped us to address the most important thing, closing the gap between the perceived inflation and the actual inflation. And have you done any calculations? How big could the share of imputed rent be in the CPI? I would say even more. We conducted some calculations based on the GDP calculations made by Rostad. Without exaggerating, it could be 10 to 15% of the basket. And according to our initial estimates, it would not affect historically the price level over the last 5 years, but we would very much like to understand what the dynamic influence would have been, because we understand during shocks, during recession, lease rates, rent rates go down, and food and other goods are becoming increasingly expensive. So the volatility of inflation is going down, but I do not think that this would have had a large impact on long-term inflation. A report from the Bank of Russia has said that inflation targeting is overall successful, and I think if we had taken account of the imputed rent, then the outcome wouldn't have been different. But as far as I understand, if we had done it, then our overall results would be low, the outcomes, the statistics. I'm not sure. I think that we should have a very long look at the housing market, which we're not that well versed in. Yes, last year the rent was going down in the center of the city, whereas in the vicinity, in the suburbs, it was growing. So I think such studies are very relevant and very interesting. But what does Rostad think about this issue? My question will go to Pavel a little later, but before that, I suggest we should move on to the second part of our today's discussion. And this part is going to be dedicated to some nuances in calculating the CPI that Alexander has already started to talk about. And under this section, I would like to ask the panelists to share their views on why the assessment of perceived inflation in Russia is starkly different from the actual inflation that is calculated by Rostad, the Federal Statistics Service of Russia, because the difference can be 2 times or even more than that if we look at the perceived inflation rate provided to us by the Federal Monitoring Center. The reasons for that are known to us on the whole. It's comprehensible that we have a big differentiation of inflation rates across and between different regions, which is, of course, a factor that impacts the assessment. Moreover, each and every consumer has their own set of goods and services. If you look at 556 goods and services represented in the consumer basket, if you analyze those goods and services, then you'll see that out of that list you consume, I don't know, 1/3 or even less than that. Whereas some things that you do consume, well, you won't be able to find it in the consumer basket, so each and every consumer basket is individual, is specific. Recently, the Bank of Russia has launched a special website to calculate personal inflation, and you can use that calculator. The interface is very convenient, and the methodology behind that is carefully thought through. We had been working on that for quite some time, so you can use that calculator to assess your personal inflation rate based on your consumer basket. So yes, there is regional differentiation in inflation rates, and then there is the issue of personal inflation, and these two factors do explain why the perceived inflation rate is somewhat superior to the actual inflation rate. But I think there are also other reasons tied to perception of prices. Very often, a spike in prices for certain goods, for certain services, especially if these are essential goods, they have greater impact on your perception of what the inflation rate is than if you look at a wider range of services and goods. And I would like to know which of these two groups has greater impact on perception of prices and increase in prices. I think I'll start with Alexander once again. I think you are not going to criticize Rothschild in terms of calculation. I would be very interested to listen to your analysis of those parts of the methodology that have to be improved when the consumer basket is calculated. Yes, thank you. I do agree. Far be it from me to criticize. Yes, there are issues we talk about together with Rothschild. There are issues that are raised at workshops organized by Rothschild. This is something that people are interested in, and this is not criticism at all, not in the least. And if I were to respond to your question, my answer would be as follows. First, we often say that there is volatility of food, and that is how we explain the difference between perceived inflation and actual inflation. This is a good argument, but that's not all there is to it. As I said, housing prices are going down and food prices too. But this volatility cannot be expressed only through that, and I think housing is a very important component to help us explain this gap, this difference. The second part of our question that shows to us the big trends, we need to take into account quality too. If we look at our consumer basket, then we'll see that there are some categories, and it's very hard to find some objects to follow. Yesterday and today, lease, rent, you cannot simply explain away the apartment through the number of rooms it has. If we look at a one-room apartment yesterday and today, and if we compare the prices, we also have to take into account the fact that it's closer to the center of the city, whether there are one kindergarten in the vicinity or there are four. So when we simply compare prices. It's not enough to compare the price. You also need to take into account different quality specifications. Or let's have a look at used cars. The price of the car that we register today does not boil down just to the fact that it's a foreign trademark or to when it was produced. There are other characteristics like mileage, which we have to take into account in order to calculate pure net price signal without being confused by quality differences of just a handful of goods that we can follow. So in order to improve the index, you need to improve how largely you take into account the quality of goods and services you analyze. I think the time has come to give the floor to Pavel Malkov, head of the Russian Federal Statistics Service, Rosstat. Pavel, we have already listened to some suggestions and also some criticism with regard to how the CPI is calculated. What do you think about that? And how does Rosstat respond to the ongoing discussion in the professional community on the subject? And could you share your plans with us too? Thank you, Kirill. Let's start by looking at the origins of this discussion. We deal with prices every day, in office, at a gas station, everywhere. Prices are everywhere. This is a very delicate subject, and no one is spared the influence of this subject. And the CPI, I think, is probably the most widely discussed indicator Rosstat has everywhere and always. And the number of people who are interested in that are so, well, they're so numerous. And why do we have criticism? Why do we have this discussion at all? First, there is the substantial discussion with experts, with professionals, and this is the best constructive criticism, the best we can hope for, because it pushes our statistics science forward, it improves it. There is another reason for this discussion, and you mentioned that perceived inflation and your personal perception of inflation, usually perceived inflation is higher than the official figures, and this is where the discussion stems from. And as Kirill has said, this personal perception is based on a personal consumer basket, based on the goods and services procured by a concrete household. And there is another psychological factor. Very often we register price indexes growing for the goods that have become most expensive, like take buckwheat. We see it's become more expensive, and psychologically we simply spread that to other goods. How do we calculate the official CPI? As you have said, Rosstat collects monthly information on 556 goods and services in 182 goods, and the range of goods and services is adjusted on a permanent basis, taking into account personal customer and consumer preferences. And of course, there is a certain weight to each and every position, and that is also based on a big study, on big research, and all calculations are conducted in strict compliance with international recommendations based on carefully thought through mathematical models. And I can tell you that the CPI is not just the most widely discussed, the most sensitive indicator. This is probably one of the indicators that are best thought through from the point of view of mathematics behind it and modeling methodology. On a constant basis, we have inspections from the IMF, and we get a certificate of full compliance. Now, getting back to personal perception of inflation, we are not just publishing the CPI, we are also publishing figures on each and every set, and you can collect your own consumer basket and you can see what the real growth is, not just psychological perception of that. It can be due to different factors, economic factors. Sometimes, prices can even go down. Carrots are becoming more expensive. Milk is almost the same, whereas eggs, the prices of eggs are going down. And all of that together shapes the perception of the CPI. Rostat has been extending the range of information that you provide citizens with. And yesterday, when the data on weekly inflation was published, and there was a very strong spike, but then Rostat published right away the methodology and the technical explanation. The reasons were technical, and even not all experts take into account all of these things.
Открытость — это вообще наше главное оружие сейчас. Мы стараемся увлекать как можно большее количество экспертов. Я, кстати, извиняюсь, один тезис еще по личному восприятию инфляции. Такие опросы проходят во всем мире и везде, во всех странах. Фиксируется, что личное ощущение инфляции опережает официальные цифры в 1,5-2 раза. То же самое мы видим и у нас в России.
Это да. Все-таки вот возвращаясь к той теме, которую Александр понял.
But going back to the topic Alexander's raised, what do you think about imputed inflation? Imputed rent, my apologies. Yes, it's another area of discussion with experts. We're in constant dialogue, like Alexander said.
Сегодня вот ни один эксперт не скажет, что мы отгородились и не слышим. Есть ряд предложений по совершенствованию методики, в том числе по вмененной ренте. Мы взяли этот вопрос уже в проработку. Сразу скажу, что это не минутное решение. Требуются очень серьезные, взвешенные расчеты. Эксперименты. Даже, Александр, у вас звучало выступление много таких субъективных оценочных суждений, даже прозвучало слово «интуитивно», правильно? Все это сейчас нужно подтвердить, подкрепить достаточно серьезными экспериментами. Поэтому в этом направлении мы работаем. В этом году и в следующем году будет проводиться большое количество экспериментальных расчетов. А будет вмененная рента учитываться в индексе потребительских цен или нет, будет решено только тогда, когда мы увидим все эти цифры.
Like Alexei said, this isn't something new or unknown. We use imputed rent to calculate GDP.
Включать эту сущность в индекс потребительских цен покажут соответствующие расчеты, эксперименты и опять-таки дискуссии с экспертами.
But we're yet to see. We're yet to discuss it with the expert community. But will we get the answer by the next year's forum? Yes, I hope so. Okay, note taken.
Пора, по-видимому, передать слово
Now I think
Александру Геннадьевичу.
it's a good moment to give the floor to Alexei Gennadievich, who will share
Департамент исследований и прогнозирования.
the results of research his department did, the Department for Research and Forecasting. Let me start by saying that the Department of Research and Forecasting is very critical, especially when it comes to price-related information, because this is what we're in charge of, and also because we prepare information for our leaders, and we need to be sure that information we provide truly reflects the situation of the economy. I will save conclusions for the end of my statement, but we currently see that the methodology that is used raises a number of questions. Please bring my presentation to the screen. For instance, we've analyzed
влияет на динамику цен на услуги, не весь индекс потребительских цен, а именно цены на услуги, учет или не учет цен на зарубежные
service prices fluctuation is impacted by cost of foreign travel. And we've seen something out of the ordinary last year. People did not travel abroad due to the pandemic, and foreign travel prices stayed unchanged, and that slowed down the overall price growth. Now the situation has changed, and you see the two lines, red and blue, are basically merging. So if we try to improve existing methodology and better account for prices for foreign travels, tourism mainly, you'll see that the overall impact on inflation will be insignificant. So methodology could be improved, but from the consumer price index point of view, the situation will not change dramatically. So what is it we could improve?
Мы уже сделали альтернативный расчет, второй слайд.
We
Как бы у нас
made an alternative calculation already to show how consumer price index dynamics would look had we taken imputed rent into account. So red line is factual CPI and its fluctuation, and blue line is CPI incorporating imputed rent of 20%. 20% is Россtat data. So you see the difference. The difference is significant when inflation spikes, but in normal periods, the situation is not that big. So inflation becomes less volatile if we take imputed rent into account. So from the monetary point of view, it would be a good thing if imputed rent and imputed inflation was to be incorporated. But it's not as simple as just incorporating a new indicator. This change has to be endorsed by the general public so that people would not think we're trying to play with figures to artificially low inflation figures. So there has to be good rationale behind any change. Now, talking about the actual change from the point of view of price dynamics, whether we do reflect actual change that's happening. You remember that this famous quote from Russian literature by Griboyedov, whether books lie or not. So just to show some results, blue dots correspond to price dynamics since fourth quarter 2017 to third quarter 2017, and red line price index calculated using comparable types of products based on customer receipts. And as you can see, the dynamic is similar, levels are similar, so I wouldn't say that factual price is paid. And price dynamics changed significantly with statistics published by Россtat. There are deviations, I agree, because, well, different indicators are used, but the clear conclusion is that Россtat correctly sees the dynamic and identifies consumer price growth in the economy. I mean, I understand people will now say, don't you shop? Don't you see with your own eyes? Of course I do my shopping. And had you asked me as an ordinary person, are prices growing? I would say yes, by at least 10%. And my perception would be very much similar to those that participate in polls on inflation expectations and actual inflation. But when I start considering that as an analyst, I see that certain prices have indeed gone up by 10%, which is a fact of life. And it's easy to see. You just go to Россtat website and you see price dynamics and price levels for different types of products. But then I would think there are different payments I make, like built-in phone or cell phone, and those prices remain unchanged. So if you calculate an aggregate index, you'll see that spike of 10% for certain positions would be balanced by stable prices and other products and services. So there's definitely a gap between inflation perception and actual inflation. Pavel mentioned correctly that globally, this phenomena where inflation expectations are higher than actual inflation is something very common. It's hard to find a country where the situation would be different. So we've looked at the situation in a number of countries, and I can give you an example of Eurozone. ECB is striving to push inflation up to 2%
медиану, если вы посмотрите,
so unsuccessfully. But if you look at the average inflation expectation of the past 2 years,
фактическая инфляция ниже 2,
it's
воспринимаемая инфляция
5% on average. So perceived inflation is 5 to 6%, while actual inflation is less than 2%. In the US, perceived inflation is lower than in Eurozone, it's 2 to 3%, but it's still different from the actual inflation. And long-term inflation expectations, if you look at midterm, for instance, it remains low, both in the US and in the Eurozone, which means there's a lot of anchoring happening. When inflation changes even significantly in other countries, their inflation expectations remain unchanged. Unfortunately, the situation is different in Russia, and the Bank of Russia has said on many occasions that drop in inflation expectations and anchoring are important goals that we pursue through our information campaign, because that would help us and pursue our monetary policy. So we're working on that. We've achieved certain successes. If you look at how inflation expectations changed over time, you'll see that there's a lot to be done. Well, inflation expectations are very interesting topic. And it's important.
Актуальный вопрос. Но, кстати, мне кажется, что и в США
To take into account
инфляционные ожидания тоже потихоньку поползли вверх.
when working on monetary policy. But would you agree that inflation expectations are going up in the US? And FRS representatives have been saying that if situation persists, they're likely to take action. So before we move on to the third part of our discussion, let me read out a number of questions we're receiving from the audience. Unfortunately, we will not be able to answer all the questions we're receiving. And I don't want to raise questions that fall outside the scope of our discussion. But some of the questions we received are very relevant. There's Vladislav Borshov who's asking, would it make sense to reduce the size of basket to calculate consumer price index and bring it closer to the actual products that are daily consumed, because this is how people judge price dynamic? Maybe that would help build confidence and trust of the general public. Who's ready to start? Well, my short answer would be no. We often hear suggestions to take an existing indicator and use it for a different purpose. For instance, take into consideration happiness index, or maybe reduce the size of CPI. But I mean, you have all the data. You have all the data you need to calculate any index. You can take any data from Росстат, and if there's at some point demand, Росстат, I'm sure, could start publishing additional indexes. But I disagree. We need to get rid of existing indexes and create new ones. I mean, all the data is there. We can do our calculations, or we can request Росстат to calculate additional indicators if that's important. Let me add, we're following international best practices, and CPIs is based on best international practices, and 556 positions is a golden standard. There are people that calculate over 1,000. There are countries that only look at 200. I think Bulgaria will look into 100 something. But 556 is the golden average that helps us reflect the situation in the economy. I mean, it's easy to calculate any index. You can select products that you consume and calculate fluctuations for it. But I mean, we publish all the relevant data, so should you be willing it would be easy to do so. Another question, Elvira Nabiulina yesterday mentioned that the Bank of Russia is planning to do its monetary policy review. Is it likely that additional indicators will be added to inflation targeting? Let me start by answering this question. Monetary policy review is a set of a number of tracks on which we'll do research. We don't yet know the answers to many questions, so we cannot anticipate the results of the review. So the idea is exactly to understand and to explain to the society what the situation is in respect of the most urgent matters of monetary policy. So in 12 months' time, we'll be able to share the results of this review. And this monetary policy review will be a very broad work and will encourage experts to participate and provide their opinions on the most relevant topics of the monetary policy. So the third group of issues has to do with new technologies. You all know probably that large volumes of data are available now. Databases of pricing, of e-commerce, tax-related data, remittances data. So we have additional sources of information. And now is probably a good moment to give the floor to the Deputy Head of the Federal Tax Service, Andrei Budarin, who will tell us about this data. And how this data can be used for decision-making.
Данные по онлайн-кассам мы получаем с конца 2016 года.
We've started getting cash operations data since the beginning of the experiment.
На сегодняшний день, конечно, можно говорить, что там все этапы, которые были запланированы нормативно по внедрению, они все завершены. У нас
We've finalized introduction of data collection.
Предприятий, которые торгуют, в общем-то, и услугами, и товарами, они применяют кассовую технику. Там остается небольшая серая зона.
Today use cash registers. Gray zone remains, but it's very small and statistically insignificant.
На сегодняшний день это 3,5 миллиона.
We're talking about 3.5 million of cash registers that issue about 200 million checks per day. The information is structured, so we know when a good or service was sold, who sold it. We collect a lot of information about goods and services, but not all. So it's very important data, not just for fiscal policy, for analysis, but also for analysis of goods. And this is where we see the link with the consumer price index and inflation targeting. But as we work with this data, we see a significant complication. There are no unified registers of goods and services in the Russian Federation. So each taxpayer that uses a cash register has his own nomenclature of goods and services, and he calls a good or a service the way he thinks is right. This is something we can try and streamline to be able to better use this data. So we apply machine learning technologies, semantic analysis, AI networks. We can create groups of products with high precision. But if we want to target inflation, if we want to use CPI for that purpose, that would require a lot of work. So we have not completely uncovered the full potential of this data. Because when we identify category, it's rather blunt. So we cannot go down to a specific brand with existing technology, not at this point in time. But this is where we're going to be going in the future. And once we are able to achieve good precision level, we could use this data better for the purpose of CPI calculation. Talking about the volume of data, well, that allows to build different models, not just semantic and cluster analysis, but we could do predictive analysis, high precision, and that would be data available daily. It's a great data set to be used for predictive technology. Second, this data could be used to either clarify or improve existing CPI calculation. And, well, we shouldn't be the ones to fantasize about it, but we're ready to share data, and we cooperate very closely with Росстат. By the end of this year, we're planning to start handing over this data to Росстат on a regular basis. But as to how this data is to be used, in a more efficient way, should it be used as part of an index? Should we try and calculate additional indicators that would add value or add precision to the CPI? For instance, we collect data on the volume of goods and services sold, so we could profile consumption of different types of goods and services, and it could help make the CPI more precise.
Намного комфортнее и правильнее говорить о том, что как эти данные могут применяться.
I'm sure
в этом смысле обеспечили
colleagues
набор
will find good way to use data. We on our part collect this data, analyze it, and we're ready to provide this data for your analysis and share information about how we collect this data. Thank you very much for that. I understand Росстат is also working in this direction. Do you have any results? Oh, using cash register data is one of the most promising lines of work to improve CPI. And what's important, we're not changing the methodology of CPI calculation. So cash register data is just a new source of data that should substitute manual data collection, would help increase the amount of sample, but the methodology will remain unchanged. And like Andrei said, it's not that easy. Obtaining data is not enough. You need to learn how to use the data, to analyze it. Some things are easy. I mean, it's easy to separate butter from aspirin, batteries, or gas. And sometimes it's difficult. If we talk about services, English language lesson, or apartment rentals, or holiday, that's more difficult to split. So optimistically, out of 556 positions we're looking at, about 3/4 allowed to collect information from cash registers. We anticipate first practical results next year already. So we'll work in parallel doing our standard calculations of CPI, and in parallel we'll start using data from cash registers. That would be a separate track. But before we're confident that it's a good methodology, we're not planning to stop using standard methodology. We're also using additional sources. Labeling system, for instance, we've entered into agreement with an operator, web scraping information, where we collect pricing data from internet. So we're using all the different sources. I mean, it's future, there's no alternative. We have certain questions on the quality, but there's no alternative. Let me quote Mayakovsky, who said, the future will not come along unless we work on it. Thank you. Could you share results of your recent research? Alexander. Yeah, it's the one we published recently, where we explained what is possible and what is not possible in terms of methodological use of cash register data. We reaffirmed that CPI dynamics reflects the actual situation in the economy, the real price dynamics.
подтверждает. Нужно вот еще что подчеркнуть, что у нас в данном это данные
cash registered data represent actual transactions, while consumer price index is shelf prices. So it's a little different, and I'm sure Росстат will be able to find a solution, but you should not rush ahead of things, so the process will take time, but I'm sure we'll get good results. Other than that, we're very optimistic, looking forward in terms of using cash register data for index calculation and for the purposes. Alexander, I know you also have your own project that has to do with the use of new technologies for CPI calculations. Hard figures, it's called, is it? And I think you even launched a Telegram channel.
Какие выводы из ваших исследований?
So what conclusions have you drawn?
Our conclusions are very close to the ones that the central bank has got, and the problems too, as Росстат has said, how do we process this pile of data using machine learning? Just a couple of words. Right now, we get information on several millions of goods and services on a daily basis. If you are a researcher, we will provide you with primary data. Do come to us. Then you will help Росстат process all of that data, and you can also get some training with data working together with us. If you're interested in the figures, do come to our Telegram channel. We publish the figures on a daily basis as well as our analysis. That's great. That research of inflation is becoming increasingly wide-ranging and far-reaching, and an increasing number of researchers are involved in this work. To take stock of our today's session, I can say the following. If we get back to the first block of issues, I believe we have all come to a consensus. Targeting the CPI is indeed in line with world practice, and that is the correct thing to do. Secondly, there is another important conclusion we have arrived at throughout our today's discussion. The methodology for calculating the CPI is a living process. Currently, this methodology is being studied. It's going to be adjusted. Pavel has promised us to present to us in here the outcome of your research on including the imputed rent into the CPI. And finally, the use of new technologies and data processing is probably what gives and will give a new impetus to this research. I would like to thank everyone who's been with us. I thank all the panelists too, and looking forward to seeing you once again.